Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful virtual NCA this year. My name is Ilea Marion Pig, and I'm going to be presenting on my paper, Who Tells Your Story? The Rhetoricity of Casting and Performance in Hamilton. So I remember the first time a musical truly confused me. I was young, not yet a teenager, watching Sideshow and not understanding how Violet, one of the conjoined twins starring the show, could be so cruel to Jake, a man in love with her. When Jake professes his love, Violet declares,
I couldn't bear what they would say if I loved you that way.
Jake responds back,
If I can see past your affliction, why can't you see past mine?
What affliction? What was wrong with Jake? As I later discovered, Daisy and Violet Hilton were real conjoined twins who performed in vaudeville in the 1920s and 30s. Violet could not bring herself to openly love Jake, a man described as being from the inky jungles of the darkest continent, a black man. The only problem? The Jake in the production I was seeing was white. The first time I saw Hamilton, however, was a different story. Who tells your story? This is the question at the center of the musical Hamilton. In the case of this musical, the story is largely told by a diverse cast, primarily made up of non-white individuals, which originally had Hamilton played by a man of Puerto Rican descent, Lin-Manuel Miranda, also the creator of the show and shown here. And the other male central characters, including George Washington, played by African American men. The ensemble included people from a number of backgrounds, from white to black to Latinx to Asian, but only featured one white actor in a lead role, the tyrant King George. On the surface, the original Broadway debut of Hamilton relied on colorblind casting, which promotes casting based on talent, not race. However, rather than colorblind casting ideology, Hamilton employs a strategic casting style which, as repeated by multiple members of the cast, including Miranda, is meant to share the story of, quote, America then, told by America now, end quote. But what does the color purposeful casting of Hamilton reflect about changing values and emphases in musical theater? In this presentation, I begin with a discussion of the problem of the term colorblind and how it reinforces racist practices. While in the related paper I spend time outlining the rise of Hamilton as well as critiques of the musical, I plan to use my limited time here to focus in on an analysis of the non-white casting call Hamilton put out in spring 2016. There are three key takeaways from this analysis. 1, that casting is itself a rhetorical act. 2, that Hamilton's anti-white casting call is a definitive act in decentering whiteness in casting practices. And 3, that this case study allows us to see a potential progression from colorblind casting practices, which ultimately reaffirm racist behaviors, to color purposeful casting, which destabilizes racist notions of white hegemony. While the notion of colorblindness gained traction in the 1950s and 60s, specifically in relation to civil rights, the notion of colorblind casting was primarily adopted in the 1980s as part of the Actor Equity Association's non-traditional casting project. According to Davis and Newman, cited in Cantonese, 2011, non-traditional casting is the casting of ethnic, female, or disabled actors in roles where race, ethnicity, gender, or physical capability are not necessary to the character's or play's development. This casting practice was necessary because, as the founder of the non-traditional casting project, Harry Newman, stated, quote, a 4-year study completed in January 1986 revealed that over 90% of all professional theater produced in this country, from stock and dinner theater to the avant-garde to Broadway, was staged with all Caucasian casts, end quote. Blind casting, often called colorblind casting, requires that all actors be cast regardless of marginalized or non-marginalized status. In 1997, Leslie G. Carr criticized colorblind practices as opposed to integration and affirmative action. Colorblind practices fall under new racism, According to Human and Gonzalez, quote, old racism is the overt color-centered expression, and new racism is the attitude of colorblindness in what had been touted as a post-racial society that also works to maintain white privilege, end quote. In essence, while an ideal colorblind society considers all races as equals, due to systemic racist practices, colorblind practices in actuality work to maintain white hegemony. This means that colorblind practices are inherently racist. Quote, as Halling et al. 2014 indicate, one of the most insidious forms of microaggression is colorblindness. Colorblindness holds that race no longer matters in our interactions because we have reached equal footing and therefore relies upon not seeing race as proof of not being racist, end quote. However, as mentioned above, this inherently ignores systemic practices which, whether implicitly or explicitly, favor white people and disadvantage people of color. Indeed, according to William H. Sun, the, quote, most articulate opponents against colorblind casting have been ethnic minorities, not white supremacists, end quote. In March 2016, Hamilton placed a casting call for non-white men and women for current and future productions of the show, as seen here. The language of the call, non-white in particular, set off a viral firestorm of news articles and posts claiming that Hamilton had put out a racist casting call. The civil rights attorney, Randall McLaughlin, questioned the legality of the call, stating, what if they put an ad out saying, whites only need apply? Why, African Americans, Latinos, Asians would be outraged, and you cannot advertise showing that you have a preference for one racial group over another. As an artistic question, sure, he can cast whomever he wants to cast, but he has to give every actor eligible for the role an opportunity to try. A spokesperson for Hamilton replied to the allegations by saying, quote, it is essential to the storytelling of Hamilton that the principal roles, which were written for non-white characters, except in King George, be performed by non-white actors. This adheres to the accepted practice that certain characteristics in certain roles constitute a bona fide occupational qualification that is legal. This also follows in the tradition of many shows that call for race, ethnicity, or age-specific casting, whether it's The Color Purple or Porgy and Bess or Matilda, end quote. Each of the arguments against Hamilton's non-white casting call is made from a place of neoliberal colorblind ideology. These arguments claim that by not encouraging whites to apply right alongside non-whites, by creating a casting call for only non-whites, Hamilton is being racist, not equal. This ignores the fact that whiteness is still centered in theater. Since 2015, there has only been at most one musical per year nominated for Best Musical at the Tony Awards that featured predominantly non-white casts. In at least 2 of the last 5 Tonys, there were none. The systemic centering of whiteness is still very much present in theater, despite efforts since the 1980s to become more inclusive. Furthermore, this argument seems to be mired in an expectation of what Hamilton should be, not what it is. And what it is color purposeful. As stated by the producers, Hamilton was specifically created for non-white actors, except in King George. No one would bat an eye at a non-white casting call for The Color Purple or Porgy and Bess, but Hamilton, since it is a show about the founding of the United States of America, a tale of predominantly white men, causes people to protest non-white casting calls. The importance of the actors being non-white is forgotten in the place of audience expectation. To those against the non-white casting call, these historical figures were white, and therefore excluding whites is inherently wrong and not allowing appropriate casting for the roles. However, Hamilton was created with the intention of having a non-traditional cast from the beginning. Although Lin-Manuel Miranda wanted to be historically accurate in his depictions, the race of the primary characters outside of King George and, debatably, Alexander Hamilton, were never supposed to be historically accurate. For Miranda, the tale was just as much a telling of the founding of the nation as it was an ode to the history of hip-hop. Although white hip-hop artists and rappers do exist, the music genre was created by Black people for Black people. Having a predominantly white cast performing hip-hop inspired songs would be disingenuous to the history of the genre and would not have made for nearly as persuasive a performance. Here, I must recite Dwight Conquergood's words, quote, "Culture is transacted through performance," end quote. Performance has long been considered a form of communication through which culture is articulated and spread. In 1977, Richard Bowman wrote, quote, "It is part of the essence of performance that it offers to the participants a special enhancement of experience, bringing with it a heightened intensity of communicative interaction, which binds the audience to the performer in a way that is specific to performance as a mode of communication," end quote. Both solidifying performance as a mode of communication and showing it to be something more, a rhetorical space. The space of performance, like many spaces of rhetorical discourse, can be a space of conflict. Because it is public, performance is a site of struggle where competing interests interact and different viewpoints and voices get articulated, says Dwight Conquergood. The theater may be a space where existing ideas are reaffirmed, but it has traditionally been a space of challenging and progressing ideas through the art of performance, something we see continue with Hamilton. Performance may be seen as a liminal space for both the performer and audience. According to Human and Gonzalez, quote, "A liminal space is a transitional space. It is a period of in-betweenness that may result in an affirmation of one's current identity or the adoption of a new identity," end quote. The performer must live in the liminal space, both affirming their own identity while adopting a new one, and often having their own identity altered through their roles. Lin-Manuel Miranda wrote numerous times in Hamilton, the Revolution, about how he identified with Hamilton in different ways. Through this identification, Miranda was able to slip into the role of Hamilton, living in the liminal space as both himself and the founding father. So too must the audience live in the liminal space. The audience is tasked with taking in a performance and, just as with a persuasive speech, must choose whether to reaffirm their identity or allow themselves to be changed by the performance. In the space of performance, the community is not insular, allowing for rhetorical agents to reach wider audiences. This is especially true for contemporary theater, where performances are broadcast through television, uploaded to YouTube, and even performed on the street, in short segments, for paying and non-paying audiences. According to Rakashome, quote, "Space is not merely a backdrop against which the communication of cultural politics occurs. Rather, it needs to be recognized as a central component in that communication. It functions as a technology, a means and medium of power that is socially constituted through material relations that enable the communication of specific politics," end quote. In other words, the performative space is a sphere of influence in which people open themselves to being persuaded through the actions of the performers. By its very nature, therefore, performance and casting is couched in persuasion. A performer must go in front of a casting board and, through their audition, attempt to persuade the board that they are the best fit for a role. The casting board simultaneously must decide not only who is the best at persuading them, but which performer is likely to be the most persuasive to an audience. As Broadway shows are now being recorded and distributed to wider audiences, casting boards need to think beyond who will just be persuasive to the immediate audience, typically still older, affluent white people, to the audiences of YouTube, Netflix, Disney+, and more. The shows we perform and the people we choose to perform them are rhetorical acts. According to Bowman, quote, "The emergent quality of performance resides in the interplay between communicative resources, individual competence, and the goals of the participants within the context of particular situations," end quote. My own experiences with community theater have often shown a lack of thought about inclusive casting practices that decenter whiteness in theater. Just remember my story the first time I saw Sideshow. But the casting practices of Hamilton specifically target this white hegemony, target colorblind casting, which reinforces whiteness, and works actively against a white center. They accomplish this through what I call color purposeful casting. Previous non-traditional casting practices have been criticized for their role in further empowering the white hegemony. Herb Parker, an associate professor of theater and dance, articulated, quote, "I have concerns about the continued use of these and similar terms, non-traditional and colorblind, Although the introduction of these concepts ignited a crucial process of change in the industry, the terms themselves have now ossified a collective imaginary within the theater, which works against their original progressive intentions and inhibits practices from changing." End quote. While color purposeful casting is not necessarily the solution to these concerns, it is a new step toward productive change in theater, one which has illustrated the rhetoricity of casting in theater and beyond. Thank you.